was the last time you looked at an old photograph of yourself and thought, I remember her or him? Not that's me, but I just remember who that was. Because there's a difference. There's a strange distance that can form between you and a version of yourself that technically still belongs to you. You recognize the face, you recognize the clothes. Maybe you even remember exactly where you were when the photograph was taken. But the person inside of it, they feel like someone you used to know. Someone that you loved, though someone you outgrew. Yet, at the same time, someone you miss. And sometimes it could be someone you're relieved you don't have to be anymore. I think we spend so much of our lives trying to figure out who we are, but we rarely stop to ask a stranger question. Who have I been? And maybe even stranger, which parts of those people are still living inside of me? Because I don't think we become entirely new people every time we grow. I think we accumulate ourselves. The child becomes the teenager becomes the adult, and the person who was hurt becomes the person who learned how to protect herself. Just as the one who is probably misunderstood learns how to explain themselves, or the one who was abandoned learns how to leave first. Perhaps the person who was told she wasn't enough spends years trying to become undeniable. And sometimes we don't even realize we're still living according to the rules written by someone we haven't been in years. That's what this next section of Where Light Still Lives is really about. The versions we leave behind, or as I titled this section in the book, Mirrors and Memory. It speaks of identity, self-perception, and memory. But more than that, I think it speaks to the strange space between who we remember being and who we're finally beginning to see ourselves as. When I was going through this part of Where Light Still Lives, I spent some time reevaluating where a lot of these poems actually came from. Not just the circumstances that inspired them, but the headspace I was in when I wrote them. And I think looking back, I was trying to understand myself from a distance. I was looking at old versions of me, almost like photographs, trying to figure out which parts still felt true and which parts didn't, which things I had actually outgrown and which things I had simply learned to hide better, because there's a difference between healing from something and simply becoming better at carrying it. And just as there's a difference between saying, that's who I used to be, and realizing, oh, well, that part of me is still making decisions for me. And I think that's where a lot of these poems began, just in that uncomfortable place of looking backward without necessarily wanting to go back, questioning the stories I've told myself, of just wondering whether memory is always telling me the truth, or anyone for that matter, and whether the reflection staring back at me is always telling me who I am. That's what I was really trying to do with this section, I think. Not necessarily figure myself out, but learn how to look at myself more honestly and hold the versions of me that I understand now alongside the versions I didn't understand then. To recognize that some deserve compassion, some accountability, some deserve forgiveness, and maybe some just need permission to finally rest. And that's where I want to begin today. Not with the finished version of me, not with some perfectly wrapped up lesson about identity for you all, but with this messy, sometimes unreliable, sometimes very uncomfortable process of looking back at who we have been and asking what of those versions still have to teach us, what versions still reside within us. So let's talk about mirrors and memory. Welcome back to The Journey We Take. If you did listen to part 1, The Light We Inherit, we spent a lot of time looking outward, and that was towards perception, at time, existence, wonder. at all the things that shape the way we experience the world around us, but this section turns that lens around. And suddenly, here we are looking at ourselves, which honestly I think can be much, much harder, because it's one thing to question the world around you. It's another thing entirely to question the story you've built about yourself. I think most of us carry around some kind of internal biography, a story we've written about who we are. Maybe we've been adding to it our entire lives without realizing it. I'm independent. I'm a people pleaser. I'm a strong one, or the difficult one. I'm bad at relationships. I'm too sensitive. I'm the kind of person who blah, 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 blah. And we say these things so casually, almost like they're facts, like they're permanent characteristics stamped somewhere inside of us. But where did they come from? And who told us? Was it something someone said when we were young? Something we experienced? A way we had to adapt to survive? Or a mistake we made once and never allowed ourselves to forget? Or maybe it's simply a story we've repeated so many times that we've forgotten we were the ones repeating it. Because there's a thing that happens when you tell yourself the same story long enough. Eventually, you stop calling it a story. You call it who you are. And that's something I kept coming back to while writing this section. How much of our identity is actually us? And how much of it is made up of conclusions we've drawn about ourselves along the way? What happens when those conclusions become outdated? What happens when the person you are today no longer fits the description you've been carrying? When the things that once felt like defining characteristics start to feel more like artifacts from another life. Perhaps you were once the person who couldn't speak up, and now you can't understand why you stayed quiet for so long. Or you, at one point, were so desperate to be understood, but you've learned now that not everyone needs to understand you. And just eventually realize you were never supposed to be in that place. And yet, even when we've changed, these old definitions don't necessarily disappear. Sometimes I think they linger underneath the new ones that are forming, and they may show up in ways we don't immediately recognize, probably in just the way that we react or in the things that we tolerate. And I think that's where mirrors and memory really begins for me, because memory tells us who we are. The mirror asks us who we are. And somewhere between the two, we have to figure out who we're becoming. And so, yeah, I do think that the first place we have to look is at the stories we tell ourselves about the past, because before we can ask whether we've changed, we have to ask whether we've been telling ourselves the truth about who we were in the first place. Memory isn't always as objective as we'd like to believe. We don't just remember what happened, we remember how we experienced it, how we understood it, and sometimes how we needed to understand it in order to move forward. So we edit and we soften and justify, even sometimes leaving things out. And sometimes without even realizing it, we become the author of a version of this past that makes it a little easier to live with. So what if the truth gets a little blurry when we're the ones holding the pen? Ghostwriting Innocence, a poem that I wrote, came from that idea, the uncomfortable possibility that we aren't always the most reliable narrators of our own stories. And so this is where I want to begin with this section. Ghostwriting Innocence. We all hold the pen to a story where we're always the lead, ghostwriting our innocence, line by line, to be believed. We call it truth, but it reads like a well-practiced lie. Every flaw reimagined, every fault brushed aside, casting friends as the healers when it serves how we feel, turning mirrors into enemies the moment they're real. One man's villain is crowned as a hero elsewhere, while we bury our motives in the edits we share. We revise every memory, decide what survives, cut the parts that expose us, keep the rest half alive. 1,000 soft versions of the same crooked past, each one more convincing than the last. We are authors of fiction. We swear must be true. Unreliable narrators in a skewed point of view. Bending light just enough so the damage looks small, so we don't have to reckon with it all. But beyond the drafts, we defend and refine. There's a lens that won't fracture, untouched by design. It doesn't misread, doesn't favor, doesn't stall. It sees what we wrote and what we tried to withdraw. Beyond every mask and the stories we sell, a flame lingers where the real versions dwell. Our truths are just candles in draft-ridden halls, fighting shadows that stretch far beyond them all. And when every illusion we've built starts to fall, there remains one light above us all, the one truth over all. There's this line in there. We revise every memory, decide what survives, cut the parts that expose us, keep the rest half alive. And I think that's something worth sitting with, because memory isn't a recording, it's reconstruction. And every time we tell a story, we have an opportunity to edit it. We can make ourselves look better, we can make someone else look worse, turn ourselves into the victim or the hero or the person who apparently had no choice. And sometimes those versions are necessary, I think, again, for survival. Sometimes you genuinely need a simpler version of a complicated story to get through it. But eventually, there can come a point where the story that once protected you starts preventing you from seeing yourself clearly. And that's where self-awareness gets uncomfortable, because accountability asks us to hold two truths at once. I was hurt, and I may have hurt someone too. Someone treated me unfairly, and I wasn't perfect either. I was doing my best, or I was doing the best I could, and I still could have done better. I think there's a much more honest version of being human there, not making yourself the villain, not making yourself the hero, just allowing yourself to be the complicated or complex beings that we all are. The next poem moves a little closer to home. So if ghostwriting innocence is asking us to question the stories we tell about where we've been, this next one, called Foggy Mirror, asks, what happens when we finally turn around and look at the person standing here now? Because sometimes the hardest part of growing isn't realizing that we've changed. It's realizing that we don't quite recognize the person we've become yet. I think there's a strange grief in that. Not necessarily grief for who we were, but the familiarity of knowing exactly who we were. There was a time when you didn't have to think about yourself this much. You just were. You knew your face, you knew your habits, your dreams, or at least you thought you did. And then life happens. You make choices. You lose things. You become someone else's person. You leave things behind. You survive things. You grow. And then one day you look in the mirror and realize, I know this face, but I'm still learning this person. That's the feeling that I wanted to capture in Foggy Mirror. Just this problem with identity, a disconnection. Why do we continue introducing ourselves to ourselves using an outdated form of information? We forgive other people for changing, but we don't always extend that same permission to ourselves. We say, oh yeah, I've always been like this. That's just who I am. I've never been good at that. I'm not that kind of person. But sometimes that's just who I am is actually a shorthand for that's who I've learned to believe I am. And those are not the same thing. So this is Foggy Mirror. I stand at the mirror, but the face looking back is soft around the edges, blurred by breath and the humid haze before remembering. Steam rises from something still warm. Me, or the memory of me, hovering just behind the glass. I drag my hand across the surface, a temporary truth, cleared for a moment before it fogs again. I catch a glimpse, a jaw I recognize, tired eyes with questions they no longer voice. This isn't loss. its unfamiliarity. Like waking up in someone else's skin and finding your name stitched beneath the collar. I used to know myself without thinking, without effort. Now it takes push, a shove into reflection just to meet my own gaze against the pool of who I was. But I wait, and when the glass clears, if only for a breath, I nod to the version of me still standing there, no longer hidden, just slowly coming into view. Seeing beyond the image displayed, a product of decisions made, standing in the shoes of a girl outgrowing, I ponder the person I am becoming. The mirror reveals truth, stark and clear. I can't fit the frame of mind it holds here. The line, "This isn't loss, it's unfamiliarity," might be one of the most important lines in this section, in my opinion, because there are times when we think we're grieving our old selves, when in reality we're just meeting ourselves, the new selves of that we are for the first time. And unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. That's something I wish more people talked about, because I think growth can feel wrong simply because it feels unfamiliar. The same way like setting a boundary can feel cruel in a sense if you're used to abandoning yourself, or how choosing yourself can feel selfish if you've been taught that love means self-sacrifice. We can outgrow a way of thinking and still instinctively reach for it. And sometimes I believe the nervous system just doesn't recognize healthy as safe simply because it isn't familiar yet. I think that's one of the hardest parts of becoming someone new. You have to tolerate the discomfort of not recognizing yourself. We can build an entirely different life and still carry an old version of ourselves into it. And that's where I think the mirror becomes really interesting, because a mirror can show us what we look like, but it can't tell us who we're becoming. That's something we have to learn by living. There's something peculiar about seeing an old version of yourself clearly, not through nostalgia, not through shame, just plain, simple, and clear. Because sometimes you look back and realize you don't actually miss the person you were. You miss what they believed was possible. You miss what they didn't know yet, or the innocence of not knowing how certain things would turn out. Sometimes you look at them and think, how did I survive that? That was the thought behind the next poem, The Taxidermy of Me. It's, I think, one of the darker pieces in this section, and I think the title says a lot before the poem even begins. Taxidermy is preservation, something once alive, carefully kept in its original form. And I started thinking about how we do that to ourselves. We preserve certain ages, certain memories or identities, and we keep them exactly where they were, even while everything around them changes. And I wanted to imagine what if, or what maybe it would feel like to actually walk into a room and come face to face with every person I'd ever been, every girl I had ever been in the past, not as memories or photographs, but as versions of me that were still somehow there. So this is the taxidermy of me. I am standing in a room full of girls I used to be. They're hanging on the walls like pretty hollow things, stuffed with all the lies I told myself just to stay warm. It's a silent kind of violence, watching the 17-year-old version of my soul stare back at me with eyes that don't know the ending yet. She was the one who thought the dark was a destination. She was the one who kept the lights off so she wouldn't have to see the mess. But I am the one who survived the cleanup. I am the one who took the wreckage and the 4 a.m. panic and turned them into a fever. I am the only thing in this room that still has a pulse. Look at the glow under my skin. That's the alchemy of leaving. The light still lives because I killed the girl who let it die. There is almost a cruel thing about how we remember ourselves. Like, we didn't know the ending. They didn't. And I think that matters. The 17-year-old version of me in this poem doesn't know what comes next. She doesn't know which things will pass or which wounds will become permanent, and doesn't know what she'll eventually understand. She's simply just standing there, living the only chapters she has access to. And I think adulthood gives us a strange privilege, and sometimes a cruel one. We get to look backward with information our younger selves never had. So maybe instead of asking, why did I do that? Sometimes the better question is, what did she know at the time, or what did they know at the time? Not to excuse everything, but just to understand it. Because understanding yourself doesn't have to mean approving of every version of yourself. Sometimes it simply means finally giving the past enough context to stop judging it from the future. And I think that's what makes the last part of this poem complicated for me. The light still lives because I killed the girl who let it die. I don't hear that as hatred towards her. I hear it as the kind of transformation that isn't gentle. There are moments when you don't slowly become someone new. Sometimes something in you simply says, enough. And whatever came before can't continue with you. That doesn't make the old version meaningless. Not at all. It means that their story, your story, her story, reached a point where it couldn't keep writing itself, and yours continued. And yeah, I think sometimes that could be the strangest part about growing up, is just realizing that survival doesn't always look like becoming stronger. It looks like becoming different. Sometimes long after the crisis is over, you discover the parts of it, or you discovered that parts of it are still living in the way you move through the world. So that's kind of where I want to go next. This next poem, The Ice Beneath, refers kind of to the things we leave behind that don't stay behind. Just like how a memory can end and still change the way you respond to something years later, or how a conversation can be over and then you still are living with the words you chose not to say. Another example is just a version of yourself that can disappear from your life and still shape the person standing here now. So maybe that's why looking backward isn't always as simple as remembering, because the past doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the things that we brace for, the things that we don't ask. And I think some things aren't gone. They're just buried deep enough that we've learned how to live around them. So yeah, that's where the last poem of this section for today takes us. The ice beneath. What you see is only the surface. I carry old cold inside me, not absence, preservation, nothing lost, only held too long. Call me distant if you need a name for it, but distance is only death. Misunderstood. Maybe that's where I'll leave this section. Not with an answer exactly, but with the reminder that what we see of ourselves and what people see of us is never really the whole story. That was only a little excerpt from The Ice Beneath, a very short few lines. It's a much longer poem, but I'm going to leave the rest waiting for you guys in the Lantern Room at thejourneywetake.com, along with any of the other behind-the-scenes pieces that I'm slowly adding as we continue through Where Light Still Lives. So just consider this a little invitation to look beneath the surface. There's something I feel like is important about ending the section here, because after all of this talk about identity and memory and reflection and all the people that we've been, we still don't get a perfectly clear answer to the question, who am I? But I was thinking maybe that's because there isn't one, and we're not supposed to arrive at some final version of ourselves and stay there, because I don't think that's what life's about. Since we are human, complex beings that we are, we're constantly interpreting and revising and becoming, sometimes what looks like contradiction is actually just evidence that we are still alive, and the person you were can be real without being the person you are. The things you've survived can shape you without defining you, and the parts of yourself you haven't fully understood yet don't make you unfinished. They just, again, make you human. So I think that's what I keep coming back to when I look at this collection of poems now. It's that there are things I thought I had already left behind that were still influencing me. Things I just thought I understood that I was only beginning to understand. And there are versions of myself I once wanted desperately to forget that I can finally look at with a little more compassion. Not because everything they did was right or because everything that happened to them was fair, but just because they were doing what they knew how to do with the life they had at the time and the knowledge that they had at the time. And that's, I think, one of the forms and ways of growing up, just learning how to look backward without needing to become your past again. Being graceful to yourself. So yeah, if you are listening to this and you've been feeling unfamiliar to yourself lately, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe you're standing in the foggy part of the mirror and you're in between versions of yourself, and that there are pieces of you beneath the surface that you're only now ready to acknowledge. You don't have to pull everything out at once, and you don't have to understand every memory and name every version of yourself from the past. You don't have to become someone entirely new to prove that you've grown either. Sometimes growth is simply being able to look at who you were and no longer needing to look away. I think that's when it all comes together, when you know growth has taken place. So this has been part 2 of Where Light Still Lives, Mirrors and Memory. There are quite a few more poems in the actual book, but I don't want to give it all to you guys here. So thank you for coming back to The Journey We Take and allowing me to share another piece of the book with you. There are still more sections and more poems and questions I haven't completely answered yet. So I think, honestly, that's part of the reason why I wanted to bring this book into the podcast series in the first place, because those poems were all written by different versions of me, and now they're meeting the version of me who gets to share them with you now. Until next time, guys, I hope you guys just keep looking a little closer at the stories that you carry with yourself and reflections that you believe and what actually sits beneath the surface of it all. And most importantly, at the light that's still there, even when you can't quite see it yet. This is The Journey We Take, and I will catch you guys on the next one.